Yeah.
Hi, I'm Barrett from Lancaster Theological Seminary, and this is the last in a series of 5 of Christian understandings of history and what may happen in the future. And today, I'd like to summarize things by taking a deeper dive into what are Christians saying now about the future. And the short answer is they're saying a whole lot of different things. There is no consensus, especially if you define Christianity very broadly and look at some groups that we in the Protestant main line might not be entirely familiar with. So first, I'd like to start with the vision that things will get worse. There are many groups that claim this, and their general assumption is the world is getting too secular. It is getting so secular and so godless that catastrophe is on the horizon, and that soon God will step in and put an end to history. Christ will return to earth and take over direct control of our political and cultural life. Interestingly, some of these groups conclude that if things are getting worse, and they will get so bad that they'll bottom out, and Christ will have to return again, their conclusion is then we should help that process along and help make things worse. So, for example, some very conservative Christian groups have proposed that the United States should trigger a war in the Middle East. Probably starting out between Israel and Gaza and the West Bank, and then Iran will get involved, then the rest of the Islamic world will get involved, and then eventually Russia and China will get involved, and it will be Armageddon. And then when there is a nuclear holocaust on the horizon, or it actually occurs, then Jesus will return and make everything better. So that's a view that things are getting worse, and devout Christians should help make them get worse, because that will hasten the return of Christ. Or alternatively, we're on the brink of an ecological disaster, and we should help make that worse. So burn those fossil fuels, get rid of all regulations, so that the atmosphere will become unsustainable, and then Jesus will return. At the very least, these groups conclude that we shouldn't do anything to prevent ecological degradation, nor should we do anything to particularly prevent a nuclear holocaust. So some of them say we should actively cooperate in making things worse, and some just say let's stand back and let it happen, but not necessarily promote it. Those groups tend to be Pentecostal. They tend to have a deep belief that the second coming of Christ is imminent. That view has been held for centuries. Through every century, some Christian group has said, the end is near. It's going to happen now. Christ will return any minute. That has never worked out for them, and usually they've had to recalculate. But there is a widespread, more widespread than most people in the Protestant main line realize, belief that this is the beginning of the end times. So brace yourself. There will be a tribulation and then the second coming. So that's one vision of the things will get worse. But then there's an opposite and equal, things will get better. And this is often found also in conservative circles. So conservative Christians in the United States are pretty much divided as, will things get worse or will things get better? There is a growing group that says things will get better, and will get better if conservative Protestants can take over the government. These groups are called Reconstructionists, meaning that the whole society, our whole culture, our whole political life should be reconstructed so that God can rule at least indirectly, through God's servants on earth, who happen to be them. So they generally embrace what's usually called a theocratic view of government, politics, and history. Theocratic meaning rule by God. Of course, God will not rule directly, but will rule through God's agents on earth, political leaders, church leaders, cultural leaders, who will implement divine law. They often point out that the problem with the United States and the world is that biblical principles are not our civil law, that there is a separation of church and state. And that should be removed, so that biblical laws will be the law of the land. So sometimes this is called theonomic, meaning theo, God, nomic, law, God's laws. So society should be restructured under the lordship of Jesus and Jesus' deputies on earth. And that lordship should be manifested in the arts. The arts should be censored by Christians. But in business, there should be biblical principles enacted in the business world. Education should not teach secular matters or what were regarded as godless matters, but teach Christian values. And in the family should be headed by the male. And the wife should be, at least in regard to decisions about family life, the wife should be subordinate to the husband. Some of them go so far as to say that the biblical laws in the Old Testament should be the civil law of the United States and eventually the whole world. Some of their more controversial, and this is the radical fringe of the movement, but some of their more controversial claims is that there should be the death penalty used generously as it is in the Old Testament. So there should be the death penalty for idolatry, for homosexuality, adultery, witchcraft, and blasphemy. And some go so far as to say the death penalty for disobedient children, which is mentioned in, or it's mandated in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Now this stuff is not new. The Puritans in New England had tried the same thing, to create civil law on the basis of biblical laws. So in New Haven Colony, for example, there were instances of children being brought before the magistrates and accused of disobedience by their parents. So it's like, little Johnny here got really naughty. Would you please kill him? But you know, that was never, I haven't found any record where that sentence was actually invoked, but it's interesting that parents tried that. And there were many instances of executions for adultery, and of course we all know about the Salem witchcraft trials. And the most daring one, and I really like this one, not the death penalty, but imprisonment for ill will. So like if you were mean to your neighbor, and this actually happened in the New England colonies, people would bring in the news like, so-and-so looked funny at me. I think they were thinking evil thoughts. So, you know, into the pillories, into the stocks with you for a few days. It's hard to imagine kindness being legislated, but they tried that. Make meanness illegal, criminalize it. So some of this group, who are usually called Reconstructionists, or sometimes they're called Dominion Christians, meaning the Christians should have dominion over everything, are more popular and more widespread than you would think. I've never met anyone who falls in this category in the PCUSA, the main Presbyterian denomination. But they are out there in large numbers in other Christian groups. In Roman Catholic circles, it's known as integralism, meaning that the church and the state should be integrated under the auspices of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, the Pope. And that's not new. That was the official Catholic teaching up until the early 20th century. that nations should be Catholic, that there should be an established religion in every nation, and it should be Catholicism. The Vatican backed off that in the early 20th century and eventually embraced the separation of church and state, not as just something that was tolerable, but something that was actually good for religion, because it made religion more sincere. But the folk who wanted established Catholicism never went away, and they're growing in numbers now. So there are Catholic Dominion folk, and there are also many Pentecostal folk who are Dominion theologians, followers, this Reconstructionist thing, which is, the Reconstructionists, that's the broadest category that includes the Catholics, these folks. One of their subgroups is called the Kingdom Now, or the New Apostolic Reformation. About 5-6 years ago, the Apostolic Reformation people had their major national conference in Lancaster City, in the Marriott complex convention center, and they were all over the place. Thousands of them in downtown Lancaster. Interestingly, they went to very nice restaurants. They had their name tags on, it's a New Apostolic Church. So they are a serious power in conservative Christian circles and in the church. And they have different subsets that quarrel with one another about how exactly Christianity is going to assume dominion over everything. Some of them favor placing their own members in high places in government and have sort of a government reformation and a government-sponsored revitalization of Christianity in the United States. Those numbers, their members include Ted Cruz, Newt Gingrich, Sarah Huckabee, and Pete Hegseth, the current Secretary of Defense. But not all of these folk think that the government should sponsor and guide the re-Christianization of America. Some say it should happen person by person, that you can't impose Christianity on the country until the population is willing to accept it. So first there should be evangelism, and everybody should be converted. And then governmental reforms could be initiated. Others, however, do focus not coercive governmental measures, but simply placing their own members in political office and in newspapers, media, internet, influencers. So gradually the sensibility of America would be transformed, and it would be much more receptive to their version of Christian values. And of course, foremost among them are restriction of female rights, male as the head of the household, restriction of rights for GLBTQ people, and usually a restriction on immigration on the grounds that the folk who come into the country might not be sympathetic to their vision of Christianity. In fact, they might be secular. They might be another religion. They might be Muslim. So keep them out. And that's a very powerful but somewhat surreptitious political movement. So I mention all this to suggest that there's a growing alliance of very, very conservative Catholics, conservative Pentecostals, and some folk from the more historical Protestant traditions. There are even Presbyterians in this category, although not in the PCUSA. They tend to be in the Presbyterian Church of America, which is a much more conservative group, or the Orthodox Reformed Presbyterian Church, which is an even more conservative group. There was even a denomination, I'm not kidding, it briefly lasted and then it died out, called the More Reformed Than Anybody Else Presbyterian Church in America. So this is something that's often not on our radar screen in the Protestant main line, but it's out there and it's picking up steam, and amongst its tenets are democracy is a bad idea, because democracy, in their view, is rule by the mob. And the mob could include Muslims, Jews, atheists, secular people, heathens of all sorts. So you don't want those people ruling the country. You want to restrict the electorate. So they tend to favor Christian oligarchy. Christian leaders should be in control. So that's another view of things can get better if only this group wins, politically and culturally. So they're optimistic that it can happen, they can do it. Now I want to shift to a different view, that history is oscillating, that there are ups and downs, it's like the stock market, and it's really not, in the long run, going anywhere. It is one damn thing after another. Some good things, some bad things. And there's no guarantees that it's going to work out in the end. So we don't know where it's going. It's up for grabs. We are vulnerable to political, historical, economic accidents. This is a view that has become popular in something called process theology, which is seldom found in Presbyterian circles, because it's sort of the exact opposite of what Presbyterians have historically believed. Their main tenet is, it's not just that God won't intervene to save us from our folly and our mistakes, it's that God can't. That God simply doesn't have the power to make us do anything we don't want to do. And therefore, if we want to blow ourselves up, God can't stop us. The reasons for saying that is, number one, they assert that God is primarily love, and God wants all God's creatures to flourish, to be blessed, to be happy, to get the most out of life, because God is loving. And they coupled that with the notion that humans are free, that we all know we make decisions, that we don't have to do what we do, that there are options. We can think of our own lives, look back on them and say, yeah, I made that decision and it had such and such a consequence. When they put those two things together, God is loving and God is free, and humanity is free, they conclude that the only way to preserve the notion that God is loving is to say that all the bad things that happen in history are not God's fault, that God didn't want them to happen. Because if God loves humanity and has the power to prevent tragedies, if God could have prevented the Holocaust, could have prevented World War II, and God didn't, then that means God's not loving. Because if you could intervene when things are getting really bad and love somebody and you don't, then it's your fault. So that, well, think of being a parent. Now, you want your kids to grow up and be free. Learn to be autonomous. Learn to exercise willpower. Make their own decisions. But when they're 3 years old, you don't want to give them absolute freedom. You don't want to say, you can go play in traffic if you want to, or you can drink gasoline if that's something you want to experiment with. Parents restrict freedom and will intervene when a child is going to do something that would imperil their lives or be utterly disastrous. So they say, well, if God's a loving parent, then God would, if God had the power, intervene when we're going to really hurt ourselves. But if God is omnipotent and loving, then God could have intervened and just slightly altered Hitler's genetic makeup, or rearranged the wiring of his brain so that he would not have been so homicidally inclined towards Jews, or so ridiculously expansionistic in his foreign policy. If God could have done that miraculously and didn't, then it's God's fault, because a loving parent would have done that. So they conclude that if you're going to say God's loving, then you got to say that God doesn't have that kind of power, that God simply could not intervene and rearrange Hitler's brain, that God could not have prevented World War II. It's not that God chose not to intervene, it's that God couldn't. So their view of God is God sitting in heaven watching us saying, I really want to help these people because they're really messing up their lives, they're messing up history, but I just don't have the power to do it. So the conclusion that they reach is that history is open-ended. God wants us to prosper and would like things to get better and would like history to have a happy ending, if it has an ending. That God would like to see progress, and God's trying the best God can to urge us, coax us, motivate us to make things better. But God can't snap God's fingers and prevent us from making really stupid decisions. So the conclusion of these process theologians is that all bets are off. We don't know what's going to happen, and God doesn't even know what's going to happen. That if we want to blow ourselves up, God doesn't have the power to intervene and stop us. So history, as far as we can tell, is going nowhere in particular. It could get better, it could get worse, it could have fluctuations, or we could end it all. Now, this view is not popular amongst Presbyterians because it does restrict God's sovereignty, which has been an historic major theme in the Presbyterian Reformed tradition. Woody Allen once, who even though he's Jewish, he endorses this view. He said, it's not that God doesn't love us, it's just that God's an underachiever. And that's that denigration of God's power runs contrary to Presbyterian instincts. It does, however, correlate with Methodist instincts. Many Methodists embrace this because Methodists have always emphasized free will more than most other Christian traditions. So many Methodists look at this and say, yeah, we always believe this. It's not a surprise. God, in regard to God, we're free. We can ruin our lives if we so choose. Its home base is California. It has caught on like wildfire in California. It's been going there since the 1960s, particularly at a non-denominational seminary called Claremont. And it has spread slowly eastward. It's not officially endorsed by most public figures, by media celebrities, or by politicians. But some have, the most notable being Barack Obama, who did often say, we human beings need to get our act together, because if we really want to blow this experiment called humanity, we can do it. We have that level of freedom, and God can't stop us. So there have been some public endorsements of this. Now, if you don't like any of these, this is one that's uniquely Presbyterian. Well, it's in the Reformed bloodstream. And it's this: things will get better, but things will get better because God is sovereign. God is in control of history. Even if it doesn't look like it, God will prevail. God's will be done. I want to do a little historical sketch about this. This goes way back to John Calvin, the founder of your tradition, who grew up in a very troubled and chaotic household. His mother died when he was 3. His father sent him out to be raised by other families who would get tired of him and send him to somebody else. And then his father sent him to seminary to become a priest in France in the 16th century. And then it looked like, as the Reformation started, being a priest might not be a good idea for job security, because the Protestants might win. So he shifted him to law school. And Calvin didn't like that, but he did it. And then it looked like things were calming down theologically in France, so his father sent him back to seminary. And that happened several times. So in other words, his life was chaotic. And then he ended up becoming a Protestant when France was dominantly Catholic. And so he got out of France. He feared persecution. And traveled around Italy, where there were Protestants, Protestant nobility in Italy in those days. And various aristocrats would house him and feed him for a while until they got tired of him, and then he'd have to go on to somewhere else. So then he was trying to get back into France, and he passed through Geneva in Switzerland. And while he was there, he was accosted by the Protestant minister of Geneva. Geneva had just embraced Protestantism. And this guy said to him, it's the will of God that you stay here and help me in my work to make this a reformed city. And Calvin said, no, I don't want to do that. I don't like the Alps. I don't like your food. I'm French. I want heavy sauces. You don't have them. And it makes me nervous to not be able to see the horizon line because there are too many mountains. He said, I want things to be decent and orderly. So I want to see where the land ends and the sky begins. And you can't do that here, so I'm going on. But then the minister said to him, it's been revealed to me that God will curse your labors if you don't stay. And so Calvin said, yeah, God's going to curse my labors? Okay, change my mind, I'll stay. And he did. Then the Genevans got tired of him because he was trying to introduce laws they didn't like. And so he left Geneva, went back to France for a while, into a free city of Strasbourg in Alsace, which was Protestant, and stayed there for a while. And minister there said to him, it's been revealed to me that people are talking because you're not married, and they think you're secretly a priest. You're being celibate. So to prove to the world that you're not a Catholic, I want you to get married. And Calvin said, I don't want to. I just want to write books. I just want to write theology and biblical commentaries and preach, and a wife would be a burden and a distraction. And then the minister said, it's been revealed to me by God that God will curse your labors unless you get married. And so Calvin said, okay, who should I marry? And then the minister said, I have just the woman for you. It's been revealed to me by God. And so Calvin got married. And he had at least a satisfactory marriage because he wrote as an epitaph to his wife when she predeceased him, she never interfered with my labors. Yeah. Think of that on a Valentine's Day card. But anyway, Calvin ended up going back to Geneva because once again, it was revealed to somebody that God wanted him to go back. And he prospered there, or at least he put up with it till he died. And he reformed the civic law and the theology and the liturgy and everything else. Looking back on his life, he said, it looked to me like everything was chaotic. I was getting jerked around by my father. Sometimes I was in law school, sometimes I was in seminary. I was floating around Italy and living off the largesse of other people. I was in Geneva, and then I wasn't, and then I was back in Geneva. and it looked like my whole life was an accidental mess. But then he said, looking back on it, the being in law school and seminary and learning some political skills and social skills in Italy, he said, it all fit together. And my life uniquely prepared me to be a reformer of Geneva. So I could not have done this unless all those accidents had happened to me. And then he concluded, they weren't accidents. That was God's providence. God had a plan for my life all along, and it worked out. And then he concluded that that's the way history works for everybody. It looks like things are happening by accident, but behind the scenes, God is orchestrating it all to achieve God's purposes. Now, since Calvin's time, Presbyterians have generally, not all Presbyterians, but many, have modified that view. So it's not that God micromanages people's lives, but God does in general set the main course for them and guides them and coaxes them and urges them. And if things get really terrible, God will intervene. So that's become more the current, the more or less official Reformed view, that God doesn't ordain every little thing that happens. God doesn't ordain specific cells to become cancerous, or God does not ordain specific automobile accidents. But God does urge, coax, and in the long run, will step in and miraculously fix things if it looks like humanity is going to destroy itself. So the general view is, without micromanaging, God will win in the end. That God's purposes will prevail, and somehow or other, God's eventually going to bring about love, peace, and justice on earth. We might not see how it's happening. It might be surreptitious and subterranean, but God's will finally prevail, because God is sovereign. God is not playing dice with the universe, as Einstein said. So, for the Reformed tradition in general, and Presbyterians, PCUSA Presbyterians particularly, there is an assurance that this is all going to work out somehow. We don't know how. Calvin didn't know how his life was going to end up, but it did end up being a monument to God's love, justice, and glory, and so will history in general. That view has become, I think, the dominant view, endorsed more or less by the various statements from the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, and also by many Reformed theologians, and by some high-profile political figures. Probably the most dramatic being Al Sharpton. You know who he is and see him on television? Pastor in New York who's got his own show on, I think, MSNBC. And his message is, you got to work hard to bring about love and justice on earth. You got to do everything you can, and sometimes there will be setbacks. Sometimes God will allow setbacks and look like things are going backwards. It will look like injustice is winning. But in the long run, God has promised that love and justice will prevail on earth. And if we really screw it up, there is the hope that God will directly intervene and bring about a situation in which the lions lie down with lambs and Palestinians get along with Israelis and Democrats get along with Republicans. How that's going to happen, we don't know. And in the meantime, it can look like things are chaotic and not making sense, and there is no progress. But long term, there is. So those are the main options, I think, that are going on in Christianity, and they spill over into political life and cultural life. And just to rehearse them, first view we looked at is things are getting worse. And that's a good thing. Because if they get really bad, then that'll force God's hand. And Jesus will have to return to fix things. Oh, one thing I didn't mention was that an implication of that is Jesus, well, in this theology, Jesus has to return to Jerusalem, and there has to be a temple there. So in order for Jesus to return, Israelis must have complete control of Jerusalem, destroy the mosque, the Dome of the Rock, and rebuild a Jewish temple in its place. So and then Muslims will attack, and Christ will have to intervene to save Israel. So these folk politically end up being dramatically pro-Israel, like support Israel at all costs. And if that provokes a war, that's okay. Even if it provokes a world war, that's okay. Because things have to get worse before Jesus returns, and there is a second coming, and things will get better. Then we saw a different view from conservative Christians that things are actually getting better and will get better, especially if the conservative Christians can control the government of the United States and eventually of the world. To recap that, they differ on how that's going to happen. Maybe it would be by direct governmental takeover and by governmental fiat. Maybe it would be by converting everybody in the United States to this vision. Maybe it would be by gradual influence from political leaders who are conservative Christians and influencers who are conservative Christians, but somehow or other, it's going to happen. And then we looked at the view that, well, history just oscillates. Good things happen, bad things happen, and that's all we know. Because people have freedom, and God cannot or will not override that freedom. So we really don't know what's going to happen. Could have a good outcome, could have a bad outcome. We might blow ourselves up, or we might not. But for the time being, all we know is that things are up and down. There's some progress, and there's some regress. And then we looked at the more somewhat agnostic Reformed and Presbyterian view, that we don't know about how God operates in history or what's going to happen exactly. But we do know in the long run, the sovereign God we worship, who's very powerful, will win. That God's purposes of love, peace, and justice on earth will eventually happen. And that, as one Reformed theologian, Cornelius Plantinga, said, heaven will come to earth. He concluded that heaven is not a place in another dimension where we will go in a disembodied state, but rather heaven will come to earth. And they got very fanciful about it and said, it's on earth that the dead will be restored. Resurrection will be returned to earth. And when people objected, well, it's going to be very crowded. And he said, the earth will expand. Yeah. God's amazing, God can do all things. But the promise is there will be love, peace, and justice on earth. Heaven will come to earth, which is what Revelation 21 says. So that's an optimistic view, saying that in the short run, we don't know what's going to happen, and it looks chaotic. But in the long run, there's a pattern, and the pattern is that things are getting better, and that God will, somehow or other, that we can't imagine, ultimately be victorious. So my theme has been that all these views are found in the church, in different kinds of churches. Some more common in conservative churches, some more common in the Protestant mainline, some more common in Catholicism. But that all of them have implications about hope for the future or fear of the future. And all of them have a spillover influence on the general culture and political life. If you're hoping for the future, you got to take politics into account. You know, what's going on structurally with the economy, with international relations, etc., and what's going on in the culture. So that for none of these groups can faith and politics be separated. Church and state, for many of them, can, but faith and politics, not. And most of them are guardedly optimistic. Process theology is the exception to that rule, where you just don't know. It could be good, could be bad. And all of these have secular equivalents. If you watch a lot of movies or TV shows or stream things, you'll see right now there's a rash of apocalyptic movies about the destruction of the earth and we destroying everything. And movies like that have come along for a long time. But there are also movies about gradual progress and hopefulness for humanity. And then there are other movies where you just can't tell. You don't know, is this optimistic or is this pessimistic? So all these voices are out there, not only in the church, but in the popular culture. So I wish I could give you a definitive answer of how things are going to be, but I don't have one. There are a variety of opinions in Christianity and in the broader culture. My own predilection is for the Reformed view, but somehow or other that we can't fathom, God's going to win, even when it looks like injustice and war and oppression are making tremendous steps forward. With that, love, justice, freedom will, in the long run, be triumph because God has promised it. So, now I'd like to invite responses, observations. Yeah.
I've been a Presbyterian all my life. I'm not sure if you categorize me as a Methodist or not. But first of all, I don't worry about the future because I think God will take care of the future.
No, that's Presbyterian.
Okay, but here's the other part though. What makes sense to me is maybe that God lets us rule this world as people, that whatever messes we get into and so forth and so on is our making. And whatever situation a person gets into, whether it be bad, good, somewhere in between, God, because this lifetime is like a blink of an eye in terms of, of eternity, that God judges us according to the situation that we were in. And if you talk about eternity, well then we'll be judged for eternity. Yeah. And that's pretty much it. And God can perform a miracle at his choosing, individually say, but I think more or less we're in control of our world, and God judges how we as individuals react to the situation that we're in.
Yeah, I'm going to expand and twist what you just said.
Okay.
Because what I didn't talk about was many kinds of Christians for which the future of history is not that big a deal. Because the important thing is the reconciliation of the individual with God. And that will have eternal consequences. So it's about salvation of individuals. That's not exactly what you said, but that's
pretty good.
Okay, good. So don't worry so much about the future. Worry about yourself. Worry about your own spirituality, your own moral development. Are you growing in faith, hope, and love? Are you being a good disciple? That should be your main concern. And don't worry so much about where history is going. Often there's a footnote. Somehow or other, it's going to work out okay, because God is sovereign. So thanks for bringing that up. That for some folk, this is not an issue, or maybe at least it's not the primary issue. And what happens? What will the future of humanity be like?
Although I would say, as an individual, you may well be led into politics or led into military. or led to help other people. It's not an individualist thing, really. It's what you do with your own life.
Right. I'm going to expand on that too, because there was a very influential Reformed theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr, in the mid-20th century, who said, here's the good news. God has called us to work with all our might for love, peace, and justice on earth. That's our mandate. That's our marching orders from Christ. That's the good news. The bad news is you're not going to get very far with it. You have to try, but there's no guarantees it's going to be successful because humanity is incalculably sinful. But try. Yeah.
So then with the implications for the power of prayer would run from pray really, really hard and the Al Sharpton approach to save yourself trouble because prayers aren't answered.
Yeah, but that's an interesting point. The prayer would be different in each of these views.
Yeah.
For Presbyterians, an ideal prayer would be, thy will be done. Because that prayer is going to be answered. That God's will, somehow or other, will be done. So that would be I'd call that a prayer of submission to God's work. Leave it to God, trust God. In the meantime, do what we're supposed to do. But for the folk who think that history is getting worse and will get worse until Jesus comes again, then the prayer should be, come Lord Jesus. Return as quickly as you can. For other groups, it might be prayers, petitionary prayers for, please let our political party win. Please put the godly people in positions of cultural power. So prayers would differ. And even for process theology, a prayer would be, I'm going to caricature this. Okay, God, I know you can't do much, but do what you can and help me be resigned to whatever happens. Okay. Other observations? Yeah.
A question. When some of us went to Scotland and Ireland last year, John Calvin had a house in Edinburgh and went to the church there. What part of, he was in Geneva, yes, and so on and so forth. What part of his life was he in Scotland?
Well, I think you're thinking of John Knox.
You know what? I am thinking of John Knox.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. You're right.
Yeah, John Knox was, he had studied under Calvin and then went back to Scotland and was the major reformer of Scotland.
Yeah.
Was very powerful. If you've ever been to Edinburgh, Knox preached a sermon in St. Giles Church on the Royal Mile in which he condemned Catholic images, statues, stained glass windows. And he got the congregation so fired up that they immediately, after the sermon, ran down the hill to where there was a monastery with a very glorious medieval chapel, and they tore it down. Smashed the stained glass, broke all the statues, and pretty much destroyed it. So now that in Edinburgh, all there is the ruins of that monastery.
Yeah, St. Giles is where we attended our first service.
Yeah. That's the Vatican for
Okay.
Presbyterians. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Let me ask you this. Would anybody like to put in a good word for things are going to get worse until Jesus can't stand it anymore and directly returns to earth and fixes things. I'm not seeing a lot of enthusiasm for that one.
Is that a good Presbyterian stance?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Good.
Yeah. How about the Reconstructionist view that biblical laws should be instituted in the United States? And that would require getting rid of the separation of church and state. So get rid of that, maybe get rid of democracy. But there should be godly leaders who love biblical laws and are willing to enact it. And then the example of the United States would spread throughout the world. And then there would be a biblical world obeying God's commands. Okay. So far, so good. But I keep stressing that because many of those folk are Pentecostals, some are Catholics, some are Baptists, some are even in the Protestant main line. But their forces are surging, and they're getting more and more influence. Okay, how about history's just going to oscillate. It's largely governed by accidents, by some good decisions, some bad decisions, and we just don't know if things will get better or get worse. It will probably be a little bit of both. Sometimes things will get better, sometimes things will get worse, and we don't know how it's going to end. Okay, that's interesting. First of all, I finally got a response. You voted for something. And what's interesting is that I'm betting that 30 years ago, if I'd asked that question in a mainline Presbyterian church, very few people would have been sympathetic to it. There had been a view of divine guided providential progress. But I think things have happened in the world, in the nation, and more broadly in international relations and in the ecosphere, that folk aren't so sure about progress anymore and don't know what's going to happen next. And looking back over your life and say, well, there was a time when I was pretty optimistic. I thought humanity was on the road to perfection. And then terrible things happened. And then good things happened and I got optimistic again. But then more bad things happened. So looking back, it just looks like the stock market. It's wildly erratic. I think I probably fell in that category because I grew up, spent my teenage years and young adulthood in the 60s. And the general notion was we're on the verge of the age of Aquarius. And civil rights is going strong. There's a social safety net. All Russia, the Soviet Union is declining. China hadn't become a powerhouse yet, so it looked like the economy's going to expand. New houses and new churches and new classrooms are going up in the suburbs. It's all going to be good. Yeah, and then didn't happen quite that way. I think 9/11 was a big blow to belief in inevitable and uninterrupted progress. And then the political vicissitudes of the world, and also the Russia-Ukraine war, a whole lot of things, I think, have made people much less optimistic. Okay, so the last one is God has given us some freedom, and we can make mistakes, and God will allow that. So we're not quite sure what's going to happen, but in the long run, we know that God's going to win. That God is indeed sovereign over history, God is in control, and if things get really, really bad, God will intervene. so that somehow or other God's going to win. God would prefer to win through our cooperation, by our responding to God's providential urges. But if we don't, and we prove very recalcitrant and uncooperative, God will somehow or other take over and make sure we don't blow ourselves up. I mean, go for that one. Okay, these are the good Presbyterians amongst you. Let me ask this blunt question. Is it possible that God would allow us to blow ourselves up? And that might happen? How many would say yes?
Yes. I'll say yes.
Yes.
How many would say no? You're a grim group. Yep.
Do you ask these same questions of seminarians, and if so, what are their responses?
Yeah, well, that's a good, thank you, that's a good question. My seminary is largely ecumenical, you get all kinds of different denominations. So the responses of students pretty much graph out with their denominational heritage. So I have some students who are dominion theology people who want the church to take over the government and enact biblical laws. Those tend to be Pentecostal students. I have students who are from a more Methodist heritage, who stress human freedom and therefore conclude, many of you have, that we could blow ourselves up. We have the freedom to do that. And I have some Presbyterian students who are still optimistic and believe that God is sovereign over history and that somehow or other it's all going to work out. When they come back for Alumni Day, I discover that life has beaten that belief out of them. And they are not quite so confident as they had been. Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious about, I have some relatives who are quite convinced that we're at the end times.
Yeah.
And looking at this like cyclical view of how things are going, is there any support for the idea that we're any closer to the end times now than we've been, during the Black Plague, during all of the pandemic, any of these other crises that have occurred?
Yeah, every time there's a crisis, or it looks like a certain form of Christianity is being defeated or is in retreat, speculation about the end times occurs. So yeah, there is, especially for the folk who think things are getting worse and Jesus is going to return again, they often point to biblical passages like it says, there will be wars and rumors of wars, and there will be earthquakes in diverse places. So they'll say, like, oh look, there was an earthquake in Malamar, and there are rumors of war and wars in the Ukraine and Sudan and the Middle East. So they'll say, look, that's clear proof we're in the end times. So that is growing. End time speculation always prospers when things look bad. And some groups are even trying to calculate when the return of Christ is going to happen. And the projections vary from 2 years to 20 years. But it's going to be soon, probably in our lifetime. There's actually an institute in southern Lancaster County that specializes in this. They call it eschatological science. And they have all kinds of charts, exactly when what is going to happen, and correlate it to what's going on in the news. So that is a popular thing. And it's always been popular when there have been catastrophes. You pointed to the bubonic plague in 1348. And that did spark a lot of end time expectations. Some of those expectations have been disastrous. After England was hit by a Viking invasion around the year 1000, many Christians concluded, well, year 1000, that means Christianity's been around for a millennium. That means in the year 1000, January 1st, Jesus will return. So they didn't plant crops in 999 on the grounds that, what's the point? Jesus is going to return and it's all over. Jesus didn't return on January 1st, so there were a lot of people who were just saying, oops, where's the granary? Do we store anything? Yeah, so thanks for that observation about end time speculation.
That brings up what I said last week, is technologies, we can blow ourselves up a lot faster than say 50 years ago or 100 years ago because of technology.
Yeah, that's a big factor, I think, in the decline of optimism. And that happened again when nuclear energy came about, and Nagasaki and Hiroshima. People realized our technology seems to be outstripping our ability to control it. So that's a real dash of cold water on optimism. What if our technology is so powerful that we can't control it? Well, think of all the AI movies going on now about the revolt of the robots, and goes back to Terminator movies, and every year there's like 5 or 6 more about the end of humanity because robots have taken over. So whenever it looks like technology is out of control, I think there's a nosedive in optimism.